Darkness here. I have some bad news. One of the people I was going to talk to for my book, Richie Frangi, the famous actor, died before I could speak to him. He was going to tell me about Roy's childhood. He said Roy was always a piece of shit. Presumably, Roy was bullying and committing petty crimes after his brother's death. And if you don't remember who Richie Frangi was, well, he was the brother of Frank Frangi, who was one of Roy's childhood best friends. They knew each other since they were about four, Frank and Roy did, and grew up next door to each other. And Richie grew up next door to Roy. And the Frangis continued to be close to Roy until his death, at least Frank was. Like I said, Richie never liked Roy. Unfortunately, Frank Frangi seems to be mentally compromised, so I'm not going to be able to speak with him. He's just not in a situation where he can be interviewed. So I was going to talk to Richie Frangi, the Hollywood actor, who at first he was hesitant talking about Roy, but then he agreed to do so in exchange for a not insignificant amount of money that I can't really afford, but I was going to get. And then he died when I went to call him back. Richie was one of the older kids who picked on Roy, but don't blame Richie for anything in terms of how Roy turned out. Bullying was not what made Roy so depraved. I did speak to Richie and Frank's other brother, who's still alive, William. Initially, when I emailed William a year ago, he wouldn't even admit he knew Roy. Then this time, because I'm on good terms with his niece, he gave me a few anecdotes, but he was really too young to remember anything significant about Roy's childhood, like Richie had. And then William said, and nobody basically ever really proved anything about Roy, which is definitely not true. Roy was doomed in the court system. If you are curious why William seems a little rattled here, it's probably not simply because I'm annoying him, though I'm sure I was, but I brought up a loan that Frank took from Roy, which Frank testified was for starting his electrical company. I don't actually think it was for his electrical company, and that was confirmed when William said, I don't know where you're getting information, but he didn't borrow from Roy for his electrical company. But Frank, yeah, he borrowed a tremendous sum from Roy, or Roy gave him a tremendous sum without interest and he was paying him back. So I can only speculate what that's about that Roy was giving Frank so much money for without interest. But in any event, as soon as I brought that up, William seemed to have gotten upset and didn't want to talk further, which is fine. I have some awesome scenes with the Frangis that are confirmed. But it's not a scene that makes them look bad. Actually, it makes them look tough and it makes them look honorable. And I'm not going to bother that family any further. I don't want to upset them. Doubly so, since they just lost somebody. Now, this episode's going to be dedicated to Richie Frangi. Even if you were going to cost me an arm and a leg to talk to you, you were still going to be helpful. Now, let's begin. It was the early to mid 1970s again. Chris was alive. Albert was still a child, and everything was going great for Roy DeMeo. Roy was with his family and some friends, including Frank Frangi, on board a boat, enjoying the good times. They were in the Atlantic, not far from Long Island. It was daytime. Drinks, laughter. Little Al, who was something like a court jester to the crew, a mini-me Roy, watched, admiring his dad. Any tragedies and hardships he would know were still far in the future. Suddenly, the tranquility of this get-together became a calamity when Roy tumbled overboard. No, no, a little Albert thinks. His daddy's splashing in the water. He might be drowning. Little Al hunkers over the side, and with something along the words of, "Don't worry, Dad, I'll help you," prepares to dive in to help his dad climb back up. Roy's eyes fluttered wide. There's nothing murderous or cold about them now. There's nothing at all but fear. Not fear for himself, but for his son who's too young to play superhero and could easily drown saving him. Roy would have rather sunk below the depths himself than have that happen. No, no, Albert, you stay up there, Roy sputtered. Don't worry, I'll get back up. Roy made it back up, back on board, and they were safe, together again. Now, skip to the 1980s, somewhere far away, another location, and two other men. Kenny McCabe sat in a restaurant and flashed a photo of his wife Sandy and his little son, Kenny Jr. He had nicknamed Duke. FBI agent Anthony Nelson, his unofficial partner and his best friend, sat across from them at the table. Nelson smiled. It was touching to see a father love his family so much. Kenny was a 6'5" giant in a suit, a tough guy, stoic, who faced down and had even been attacked by burly wise guys. But the image of his wife, and Duke, or his other children, well, that made Kenny's stoic ruddy features soften, and he affectionately grinned. Nelson understood the love Kenny felt for his wife and children. Nelson felt that way about his family too. It was one of the few things that the two detectives shared with Roy. They would both kill and protect their families at all costs. By 1980, Albert wasn't an innocent child anymore. He was also worried about his dad, whom he now knew killed for a living, and could just as easily himself die someday. He flipped coins, and he pretended that if he just called it right, would somehow tell him whether his dad would come home safe tonight. Albert, who lived a seemingly perfect life on the outside, was feeling pangs of sadness, depression, and terrible anxiety. He had entered an existential nightmare that he was too young to understand. It's far easier to find hell than it is to leave it. Who were you, Roy? Snow fluttered relentlessly to the ground. White blankets flooded the Queen's streets, where the snowplows trundled. The radio warned that the blizzard was going to continue into morning and that the roads were going to be turned a lethal mixture of wet and icy. Cold was waiting for him. So were those slick roads. Detective Peter Calabro stood in his precinct, staring into the darkness dampened by street lights. He told the other cops he was waiting to see if he should try to make it home tonight, or if he should wait it out until things cleared up a little. His daughter Melissa, who was just a toddler, and his newly married wife were waiting for him at home. It was indeed dangerous driving home tonight, but the storm wasn't what Peter Calabro was really worried about. There was something far more dangerous than snow and ice that might be waiting for him out there. Peter Calabro was a marked man, and they didn't give a fuck that he was a cop, or who he was connected to. They would have gone to war with the entire DeMeo crew just to get to this guy. The problem had started in 1973. The same year that Peter Calabro became Roy's dirty cop, Peter had married an attractive brunette, Carmela Gentili, after a brief romance. Carmela herself had two brothers, Robert and James, with connections to the New England Mafia. And since Peter Calabro was a wannabe wise guy himself, who had somehow ended up a cop instead, her family ties would have probably appealed to him. In 1976, Peter and Carmela had their first and only child together, a daughter they named Melissa. Although they both loved Melissa, their daughter was really the only good thing that came from that marriage, which quickly dissolved into fights and allegations of abuse. By 1977, Peter and Carmela were estranged and headed for divorce, and they were both fighting like crazy for custody rights. It was on July 19, 1977, that Carmela drove to a Brooklyn beach to meet her husband. She was finally ready to solve this problem that she had had. They both were. And it was time to sign the divorce papers. And that should have been the end of it. But horrifically, it wasn't. Carmela was last seen by witnesses walking along the beach with her husband. They were bitterly arguing again, something that they should have been avoiding. And that Peter Calabro was really angry at her. And she wasn't happy with him either and was snapping back. And that's the last anybody ever saw of Carmela again alive. Or if they did, they never admitted to it. Just 5 days later, a Coast Guard spotted Carmela's decomposing body floating a few miles off Monmouth County. Please excuse my spelling, my pronunciation rather. I not familiar with all these words, but Monmouth, Monmouth County. Carmela's family were confident Peter Calabro were responsible. They were very, very quickly to believe 100% that this guy did it. And almost immediately, despite having some mob ties, the Carmela's family went to the cops. They even brought up that Calabro was involved in an auto theft scheme that he had told them about, referencing Roy, even if they didn't really know who Roy was. The cops were suspicious that this Peter did kill his wife. I mean, he was last seen arguing with her. 90% of murders are done by their significant other. He was a major suspect. Peter's problems, they were only going to get worse over the next few years, and cops and courts were only going to be a part of it. Soon the evidence was presented to a grand jury. The motive was obvious: get complete custody over their daughter and get revenge on his wife for making him miserable in his marriage. At that point, Calabro had already moved on over the next few years. He had married a woman named Stephanie, a younger woman. There was enough evidence as the investigation continued to go before a grand jury and take this guy to trial. Unfortunately, back then, juries might have been even more stupid than they are today. And there were a lot of people who believed, a cop wouldn't do that to his wife. They're the good guys. And after days of testimony, the grand jury simply refused to let the case go forward. Calabro was acquitted, and they concluded that Carmela had simply gone swimming and drowned, which didn't make any sense. The detective who had been in charge trying to bring her killer to justice, her killer husband, he began sobbing in court. This was a good detective, and he really, really was upset. He felt like he had failed that whole family of Gentiles. And there were a lot of other detectives who felt terrible too. This idea, this prejudice that, cops all only protect their own, it's a lot more complicated than that. There are cops who would definitely go after other cops if they think they did something. They're good, bad cops, all types of cops. The Gentiles, they weren't upset at the detectives. They understood that they did the best they could. And whatever their differences, mobster, mob connected, law enforcement, there was a mutual respect for these people who tried to bring the man that killed her to justice. So, one of the Gentiles, I think it was her father, but it's never made clear, walked up to the detective at the grand jury after he was acquitted, and he started patting the detective on the back, and he goes, "You guys have done all you can do. Now I have to do it my way, I'm afraid." After that, ever since then, ever since Carmilla's death, the Gentili brothers, the two brothers, not the father, had been stalking Peter Calabro, making threats outside his house in upstate New York, smacked him a few times, and their threats began to increase after that trial, really increase. Robert and James Gentili, the Gentili brothers, had very dangerous reputations as wise guys and tough guys. These weren't guys that you could just ignore. "We're going to get you," Robert Gentili sneered. "You're dead for what you did to my sister," his younger brother snarled. Calabro had to take these threats seriously, and that meant dodging these guys until they lost interest. Now, fortunately for Peter, Roy was paying him $3,000 a week in bribes, far more than most cops could ever make. Calabro's best friend, who was also one of Roy's childhood friends, John Doherty, was Calabro's partner, also had a wife who mysteriously died a year prior to Calabro's wife dying. She was electrocuted in a bathtub the year before, which would have been about 76. Some people suspected that he had murdered her. Who knows? But in any event, uh, they were able to make a deal. Since Doherty was now living as a bachelor, he agreed to move into Calabro's New York home. So Calabro didn't have to go and sell it and, take the time to sell it. He could get out of there faster. And by 1980, Calabro had a new home in New Jersey. He had paid over $100,000 for. It was large, posh, in Bergen County, which is in New Jersey, the far northern eastern part of the state. And it's an exclusive area consisting mostly of doctors, lawyers, CO types, professionals. Now, it was against department rules for cops to live out of state. They had to live in their own state. Uh, I don't want to go into the reasons why. I don't necessarily agree with them, but Doherty was the only cop that knew that Calabro was living in New Jersey anyway. His family put his house in their name, and hey, if they didn't know about it, they can't punish him for it. But all this was for nothing. All this hiding. Somehow the Gentilis found him anyway. Just 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks prior to this snowy night, Stephanie, Peter Calabro's wife, spotted those two thug brothers standing outside their home looking for her husband. And that sent the message pretty quickly that, hey, Peter, you're still in a lot of fucking trouble. And if they're coming this close to your new house, you're in a lot of fucking trouble. So now let's go back. It's around 1 in the morning, March 14, 1980, when Calabro turns to some cops along his shoulders and he says, "Ah, heck, I'm going to try to make it anyway." It wasn't likely the brothers were going to come to him on a night like this. I mean, come on, there were so many nights that they could try to get him. He still had to be safe, still had to be cautious, but he's going to risk it. He's going to risk getting home. So Calabro walked outside into the blizzard, and he climbed into his cheap brown Honda, sputtered it on, and headed trundling to New Jersey through the icy snow. Soon he was off the main road and taking a quiet one. He drove along West Saddle River Road in New Jersey. It's much, much more of a back road, lots of trees on each side, embankments going down filled with white snow, and a lot of darkness. So, snow and darkness were basically everything around him, along with trees. And flurries were just flying down and tumbling against his window almost as fast as the wipers could slap them away. It was a little past 2 a.m. when what happened next occurred. Calabro was probably as eager as ever to get to Stephanie and his little daughter, and he had to be tired after a long day. Then, there behind him, behind his Honda, where the blackness swallowed swirling snow and dim streetlight, something sped towards his tail. Peter Calabro was a predator, but he wasn't keen enough to know when he was being hunted instead. Vehicle followed him, swerved, and sped forward, indifferent to the ice. The darkness and slick roads had, if anything, helped them get closer to their prey. A car hurled past Calabro, and by the time he noticed the danger, it was too late. Murderous eyes peered above a double-barreled shotgun. Somebody cocked their weapon almost as fast as they pulled the trigger. A blast shattered his window and ripped through the side of Calabro's head, just below his eye. Another shot tore through his left shoulder, piercing his body with pellets, causing blood to burst out his head and against the car seat. The clunky Honda skewed off the road, jumped and bounced down that embankment, tearing through the snow and crashing into a tree. The killers, probably pleased, zoomed off into the night. A snowplow trundled along later and spotted the wreck. The men thought they had heard a gunshot, but they didn't see who killed Calabro. Nobody had. Roy had just lost his most useful rogue cop during a period when things were about to get much, much worse. Roy's criminal career had stumbled, and it was now declining as fast as a burning plane right towards its nadir, where he would crash and burn if he didn't act both brilliantly and ruthlessly. But ruthlessly how? There comes a point where paranoia becomes rational, and there almost needs to be a word for such constant terror that's grounded in reality rather than delusion. Roy was drinking heavily now. He was popping pills for his anxiety. He had that kind of terror. This was real. He had a tremendous amount to worry about, from Paul to the cops to Snitches. Now, Nino wasn't happy with Roy for leaving him to get caught during the Ippolito murders. Roy needed to come up with a remedy. This was one of the first things he needed to solve that would acquit Nino. His idea for planting a fake expended bullet with Nino as a decoy just hadn't worked out that well, as good a plan as it had been. It turned out that forensics was so advanced now that they could tell a bullet that had been discharged in somebody's neck with one that had been fired into a tub of water. Damn, this only made things more complicated. Now, Roy wanted to whack one major witness. That would make him feel better. Patrick Penny, a lowlife nobody would miss anyway. And Penny had escaped custody for this trial once he'd been quickly caught by Ronnie Cardew, if I'm saying that right, one of the detectives who was always assigned to the Nino case. And the second time that Penny had escaped, Roy had actually managed to receive a call from Penny and talk to him on the phone, where Roy had agreed to give Penny a substantial amount of money if he skipped town. Penny said he'd be happy to take the bribe and leave town. And Roy, well, he'd been overjoyed. And he drove over to Port Authority, except instead of with money, he'd gone with a Dracula and a 38 special. Rodar was one thing, but Roy had no intention of bribing Penny. Those were just lies. Penny was too much of a lowlife who couldn't be trusted, as far as Roy was concerned. He was always getting pinched for things like burglary. The little fucker could get arrested tomorrow for some new crime that he committed, and then betray Roy, cut a deal to testify against both Nino and Roy now, since Roy had bribed him, while forgetting about their bargain. So it was too much of a risk as far as Roy was concerned. Penny had to be whacked. Now, on that day, fortunately for Penny, Roy couldn't find parking at Port Authority, and by the time he and Dracula were able to spot Penny, the cops had surrounded him and were leading him away, forcing him back into hiding. In the meantime, the trial was presided over by Judge Edward Lintel, and the prosecutor was Stephen Samuel. For Samuel, this trial was personal. Just recently, Samuel had prosecuted Pete LaFrocia for the Sherry and Quinn murders which Officer Winling had taken personally. The case had been fairly strong, but then Detective Blau, that same crooked cop who had helped Roy in his early years recruit crooks like Chris, had come in and testified to LaFrocia's character. And because of Blau's testimony, among whatever details the jury had heard, LaFrocia had been acquitted, which had led to LaFrocia laughing. Now, Winling and Samuel, they thought that LaFrocia had been laughing and mocking them, but in reality, as I've spoken to him, he said he was just laughing because he was relieved that he was getting off from a murder charge. Samuel and Judge Lintel agreed to sequester the jury for the entire trial. Jury tampering was going to be difficult now. So Nino had already decided he's going to testify himself, and he'd tell the jury that he had only been a mediator that night, that the Ippolitos were whacked, and that the real killer had shot him too. Nino would go on to explain before the jury that when Rodar had pointed a gun at him, Nino had mistakenly believed the off-duty cop was actually that same hitman who had come back to finish the job. Now, Nino's trial would proceed through 1980, while other major events were taking place for the crew. And although Nino would be out of bail for most of it, he'd keep a relatively low profile during this period. He'd initially been denied bail. Judge Lintoul and the prosecutor had considered him way too dangerous to be out. But then a higher court successfully allowed Nino's appeal, much to the chagrin of Judge Lintoul, and Nino was allowed out during the trial. This trial, well, it was going to definitely be an uphill battle. Anybody with a brain cell knew that Nino was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. But Nino got lucky. Nino had a friend, a business partner, and a loan shark customer named Sol Hellman, who was close enough to Nino that they even had dinner at the bunker before. And Sol happened to have a young son named Wayne, who was engaged to a jury member named May on Nino's trial. Now, since even sequestered jury members got to see their families, Roy and Nino now had access to a jury member who might be open to being corrupted. So Roy had one of his henchmen, Joey, if I recall from my court files, which are in Brooklyn, not where I'm at currently, send Wayne a message, who then met with May and negotiated for a substantial sum, enough for May to be pressured into doing it. Since what May was doing was a serious felony, she was only a paralegal, not a criminal. How about 25,000? No, no. 50? Okay. It's for Nina. We'll pay 50. Neither Nino nor Pasante's defense attorneys knew about the bribe. This protected the lawyers and made their responses more believable when the verdict surprisingly came in. In the meantime, during the trial, the defense attorneys simply continued to grimly argue for their clients, realizing they were probably going to lose this bad despite their high price tags. I mean, let's face it, the entire OJ defense team wasn't going to win a case like this the honest way. Now, the day that the jury deliberated, everybody was irritated that May was holding out. She kept saying she just didn't believe Penny and thought Nino was probably innocent. When confronted with all the evidence, Mary admitted it was pretty persuasive, but she still wouldn't change her mind. That really made things frustrated. But, as they argued, Mary also knew that if this trial ended in a mistrial, which is what it was looking like, then Nina was going to get convicted a second time on the murder charge anyway. So she compromised. Nina was given a deadly assault charge, Passante reckless endangerment charge, and the jury agreed not to convict Nino on a murder charge, much to the dismay and disgust of both the jury members who thought Nino was guilty, which were pretty much all the others, the judge, and the prosecutor. And the defense attorneys, well, they were flummoxed that they got that. A deadly assault charge made no sense in the scheme of things, but it did still mean Nino was looking at between 5 and 15 years of prison. So he won, but he didn't win that well. I mean, it's better than life. At least, in the meantime, for Nino, his lawyers were able to successfully keep him out of jail to await sentencing. With Nino's trial over, the police didn't need Penny anymore, and while McCabe and his colleagues were willing to help Penny leave town, Penny was firm that he was staying right there in Brooklyn because his girlfriend lived there and she didn't want to leave. Meanwhile, Roy and Nino were looking to locate him, although Roy didn't know what Penny looked like yet, since it would have been risky for him or his crew to appear at Nino's trial. But Roy figured, well, Penny was a known criminal, must have a mugshot. But getting one of those wasn't going to be as easy as it would have been a year ago, since Calabro was dead, Doherty didn't want to be bothered anymore, and Detective Blau was now avoiding Roy. Roy decided he's going to have to try and persuade another cop into helping him find Penny. Now, among the regulars at the Gemini Lounge was Detective Thomas Sabota. And, well, Detective Sabota wasn't some pernicious wannabe wise guy like Calabro. He unfortunately had a bad gambling habit, just like Calabro had. Sabota owed Roy $1,000. And although he was a 6th precinct detective and knew that Roy was a loan shark, obviously, since he borrowed from him, he didn't know that Roy had a reputation as a homicidal psychopath. He thought Roy was a nice guy, or at least nice as far as loan sharks go. Hey, Thomas, I was wondering if you could help me find somebody. Me and a friend are trying to find this guy, Patrick Penny. He owes us a lot of money, and I've never even seen the guy. Don't worry, I don't want to seriously hurt this Patrick or nothing. I promise. But I gotta get my money back, you know? If you could help me with a mug shot or something, just so I know what the guy looks like, I'll erase your whole debt for you. Sabota was cautious. Roy didn't seem like a killer, but Sabota didn't want anybody seriously hurt either. And obviously he didn't want to ruin his career with the NYPD, which he was proud of. But $1,000? Just for producing a mugshot? Well, that's tempting. especially after he did a little investigating and found out that this Penny was a low-life burglar who had more than a dozen arrests just in the last few years. Okay, Sabota Quest. So long as Roy and his friend weren't going to seriously hurt the guy like he promised, Sabota'd help. He'd get him his mugshot. Soon Roy was photocopying and handing out mugshots of Patrick Penny to his crew. Well, Nino had ordered Roy just to kidnap Penny and bring him in alive so Nino could non-violently try to disincentivize Penny from testifying in the future, probably through a bribe and a warning. Roy had already decided once again to ignore Nino's orders not to kill anybody without his permission. The motherfucker had made him look weak to Nino. By sheer luck, Vito's boy toy, Joey Lee, had gone to school with Penny, so he knew exactly what he looked like and the neighborhood he lived in, the general neighborhood. They were able to confirm the mugshot, and Vito and Joey Lee began scouting that area. Eventually, the duo spotted Penny outside his apartment with a couple of girls. They saw him saunter in the apartment, and for a while they were excited. He didn't come out. So Vito, he got bored, and they went and watched a movie. Vito was pretty lazy. Now, I'm going to go into it scene for scene more in my book, but hilariously, Vito told Roy about spotting Penny, and Roy in turn basically told him to keep his gun on him and do surveillance. Now, Vito, who was the exact opposite of a Kenny McCabe, decided he didn't want to sit bored in a car all day watching for Penny, and hilariously would tell Roy he was doing surveillance and then go off and do something else, which Roy would have probably killed him for. Finally, though, Vito spotted Penny randomly at a gas station and was able to tail him to a bar a few weeks later. Several hours later, Penny left the bar and climbed into his car. He was a little drunk. He started the ignition. Silence. Kept trying, but the car wouldn't start. Hey, Penny, you want me to help you with that? Roy said, coming out of the shadows, gripping a revolver. Vito ambled behind him, holding a pair of wire cutters. Oh, get away from me! Penny screamed, shoving the door open and trying to kick Roy out of the way. Roy fired numerous times into Penny's head and torso, causing him to drop back dead. Roy glanced around, noticing Vito, wide-eyed, staring at a black man who had just wandered around the corner, oblivious to what he was headed into. This guy's fucking dead, Vito thought, as he would later state on the stand, noticing Roy gaze coldly at the stranger. The black man immediately looked down and kept walking, passing Roy and Vito. Roy just glowered at him, but didn't shoot. The black man's reaction had convinced him that he wasn't going to snitch. Instead, Roy and Vito turned and fled back to a Malibu they had stolen with Richie earlier, and they jettisoned off. Days later, Sabato learned about Penny's murder from the newspapers. At the Gemini Lounge, Sabato shouted, "You killed that kid! You told me you were just going to hurt him!" Roy threw up his hands. Hey, Thomas, I had nothing to do with the kid's murder, I swear! But Sabato didn't believe Roy anymore. The problem was, what was he going to do about it now and not implicate himself in felony murder? This, though, couldn't have made things easier for Roy. A detective now knew intimate details about one of his murders, and if prosecutors ever found out about Sabota's involvement, Sabota was the perfect candidate to cut a deal and testify since he was already a cop and he had been duped by Roy. Furthermore, Nino, he only had one more reason to be incensed. How did it look for his appeals now that a witness against him had suddenly been shot dead? Roy, who was a full-blown alcoholic now, terrified of going down for so many murders and stealing cars, was acting even worse than the maniac he had been before. Roy also had several other reasons to be worried about investigators closing in. Ever since Terry's dream had been raided, Roy had been worried about the crew and extra help flipping and implicating him. Now, just prior to whacking Penny, Roy had murdered one associate who had been the one to flip and tip off the Coast Guard about Terry's dream. On March 7, 1980, Roy had shot Joseph Coppolino several times and then stabbed him, and he'd cut his neck so deep his head had come off. Coppolino's murder had been so brutal it even made the news on TV. Roy's problems were still only getting worse. His associate, Mastrangelo, was caught on a wiretap by an informant, Joseph Bennett, one of the guys who sold equipment for the shrimp boat. He actually sold a little boat that would go out there and bring the other boat in. And Joseph Bennett had flipped to escape charges for abetting them in their marijuana imports. Now Mastrangelo's home was raided and he was thrown in jail. Casso had been killing some of the others from this fallout of the operation, but Roy had agreed to take this Bennett out if he could get to him. Then, worst of all, Roy's prized auto theft operation was hit with a first serious raid, a raid that he'd never really recover from. Operation Empire Boulevard.